Dear listeners, I'm thrilled to announce you can now pre-order the paperback edition of our book, Think Like a Vegan. This highly anticipated release will be available in the UK and worldwide from January 2025 and in North America from April 2025. It'll contain a new afterword, so you can dive into updates and new material you won't find in the hardcover. Don't miss out on this opportunity to enhance your understanding and commitment to veganism. Pre-order your copy today wherever you buy books or on Amazon or Target, and join us in thinking, living, and thriving like a vegan.
This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, I'm Amelia Lees, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan podcast, a companion to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. For more than 40 years, from the late 1800s, Ida B. Wells fought for justice for Black Americans. Wells was born in 1862 as an enslaved person in Mississippi and grew up in a family which placed great importance on education. In her early life, she was a teacher, but the continued injustices she witnessed propelled her to activism. Among many things, Wells was a journalist, a newspaper owner, a feminist, suffragist, and an organizer. In particular, she called herself a lynching agitator, and she's probably still best known for this work. She made the world aware of that horrific and completely normalized practice in the American South during the late 1800s to early 1900s. She often traveled to England and found many allies there in her struggle to put an end to lynching. While my guests today are vegan, Ida B. Wells wasn't, despite her travels to England bringing her into the homes of people who could be called proto-vegans. They were vegetarians before the term vegan was invented. And at the time, these English folks were also at the forefront of the fight for racial justice. But all activists can learn a lot from Wells' work, and my guests today examine just that. Zane McNeill and Nathan Poirier join me today to talk about their essay entitled Ida B. Wells' Historical and Contemporary Legacy and Relevance to Critical Animal Studies. It's included in a collection of essays entitled Expanding the Critical Animal Studies Imagination, Essays in Solidarity and Total Liberation, and edited by Nathan. Welcome, Zane and Nathan.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Here's a bit of background about Zane and Nathan. Zane is an independent activist scholar, editor, writer, and journalist who specializes in issues of speciesism, social justice, and queer activism. They're the founder of Roots DEI Consulting and Policy, a diverse equity, inclusion, and justice organization, and co-manager of the labor rights group Rights for Animal Rights Advocates. Zane has published anthologies on anti-carceral veganism and queer and trans liberation, and is a contributing writer with Sentient Media and Law at the Margins. They're currently pursuing a law degree at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Nathan is a professional tutor at Lansing Community College who has spent much time studying and critiquing in vitro meat from vegan and critical animal studies perspectives. And he has a graduate specialization in critical animal studies and women's and gender studies. He was co-organizer for Students for Critical Animal Studies from 2019 to 2023, and in 2022 co-edited the book Emerging New Voices in Critical Animal Studies, Vegan Studies for Total Liberation. Before we hear from Zane and Nathan, I want to contextualize their essay and their book as a whole. The main goal of the book, as Nathan writes in the introduction, is to push critical animal studies to new territories via building solidarity with other social justice movements that it has hitherto had little to no direct engagement with, and specifically the historical and foundational influence the Black feminist body of work plays for critical animal studies. This influence is all too often not made clear. While barely mentioning non-human animals, the essay on Ida B. Wells we'll hear about in a moment fundamentally belongs within critical animal studies via consistent anti-oppression by studying historical gender and racial activism through the efforts of an early and important yet understudied Black feminist. With that, Zane and Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and start just a little bit about the background and how I got interested in Wells' work. So almost 8 years ago now, it was 2016, and people were actually putting their I voted stickers on Susan B. Anthony's grave with the hope of Hillary Clinton being president. And there was this huge celebration on Anthony and other suffragettes like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt. And I found this article written by Teen Vogue actually really questioning this and this memory, because in their argument, a lot of the suffrage movement was weaponizing, or I guess almost assimilating into white supremacist rhetoric in a way to say, well, if white women get the right to vote, then we can hold bases in the South against Black men's right to vote. And Ida B. Wells was one of the figures who was really challenging that. And I was really interested not in centering these white supremacist suffragettes or suffragettes who, used and utilized tactfully white supremacy, but really the Black feminist critique of the suffrage movement in this time where white women specifically were taking up space against this idea of a Trump presidency, which I think has almost, continued to be a really problematic conversation that we're having, 8 years later. And so in Wells' autobiography, she actually recounted an event where she was talking with Susan B. Anthony about the suffrage movement and why the suffrage movement resorted to race baiting in the South, because it was a very tactful decision on their social movement attempt for the white woman to have the right to vote. And Anthony told Wells that it was for the, quote, sake of expediency for the suffrage movement that prioritized white women rights over Black rights. And she contended the suffrage movement did not want to alienate the South, with the idea that if we weren't able to get a federal protection, that we had to do it state by state by state. And that meant solidifying whiteness and white supremacy in the South and assimilating that into the suffrage argument. And so Wells accounted that Anthony stated that she did not want anything to get in the way of bringing the Southern white woman into our suffrage association. When a group of colored women came and asked that I come to them and aid them in forming a branch of the suffrage association, I declined to do so on the ground of that same expediency. And so Wells told Anthony that though she respected her and the gains that she had made for women's suffrage, she believed that Anthony had confirmed white women in their attitude of segregation. And so Wells was very active in creating spaces for Black power and Black suffrage, but in a way that really challenged white supremacy and lynch law in the South, because lynch law was this idea of solidifying whiteness by this reign of terror, that if you were challenging the normative race relations in the South, you would be lynched. And so a lot of her work was really trying to question and condemn that practice. And so a little bit about Wells more generally is that she was actually born into slavery in July 1862. Her and her parents transitioned to free persons when Ida was 3 years old. And I think as Nathan, you had actually written in the chapter that in 1884, 71 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which was a very, again, tactful decision. I think a lot of people assume that Rosa Parks actually just happened to be on that bus. It was a very specific and coordinated effort to use Rosa as a plaintiff and to have her be there in a much larger question around the civil rights movement. But 71 years before that, Ida actually had boarded a quote unquote colored car in a first class passenger before recognizing there was a drunken man in the car, and she transferred to a woman's car but was forced out by the conductor. And so she refused to give up the seat that she had paid for. And the conductor attempted to physically drag her out of the train and she was forced out of the first class section. And so she ended up actually suing the company, but lost the case in appellate court. And that really caused her to lose faith in the legal system as cementing race relations and white supremacy. And so what she moved into instead was really becoming involved with journalism. She was the editor of a Black newspaper, Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. And this gave her some of the authority to combat white supremacy and the marginalization of Black women in the suffrage movement, as Paula Giddings has written. And so what her involvement in anti-lynching actually came a very personal event. In 1892, her friend Tommy Moss and 2 other men who worked at a People's Grocery were lynched. A fight between a Black and white boy turned into a racially charged mob. 6 armed white men arrived at the store and were greeted with a hail of gunfire. The 3 men were arrested, and on March 9th, 75 men entered the Shelby County Jail, where they were being held, dragged them out, and shot them a mile outside the city. And so when Wells returned to the city, she struggled to get beyond her own paralyzing sense of disbelief to write about the lynching. And this began her insistent fight against lynching in the South. And so she wrote an editorial called 8 Men Lynched in Free Speech on May 21st and tried to write it in the white press in hopes of molding public sentiment. Recognizing that she didn't have the power to influence white politicians and community leaders, she tried to create a movement where whites would pressure each other to act in Black interests. And so between 1892 and 1900, she became known as a crusader through her writing Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and A Red Record. And she was a vocal force in the post-Reconstructive and early progressive eras. And so a lot of her work was really focused on challenging this idea of true womanhood and who had access to protection. And then part of that was challenging the myth of the Black rapist, which was used as a way to justify lynch law and cement racial and gender politics in the region.
We'll pause for a musical interlude, after which we'll return with more from Zane McNeill and Nathan Poirier. And we've got another of Matthew Gerstenberger's pieces. This is Memories/Generations, which is a multi-generational experiment. All of the starting sounds in this were initially generated by someone in Matthew's family. Matthew goes by Seismicity on SoundCloud, where you'll find more of his work. We're back for the second part of Zane McNeill and Nathan Poirier on Ida B. Wells.
What I'm going to describe is how I came to this chapter. And so as the chapter starts off mentioning indirectly, this was a partial result of me wanting to learn more about more Black women beyond the most common names that are heard all the time. So I knew of the larger figures in this sort of scene, but I wanted to dig deeper and learn about some of the names I see sometimes mentioned, but never seemingly engaged with. And so part of the reason for this was because the same Black women were being referenced over and over. Yet there's also a lot of mentioning of a long, rich tradition of Black feminism. And it is this concept that Patricia Hill Collins opens her book, Black Feminist Thought, with. So I was thinking, where are all these other Black women? And in fact, who are these other Black women that I keep hearing mentioned about directly and indirectly? So I wanted to go and try to find out some of that for myself. The second reason was itself twofold. The first part of that is because Critical Animal Studies, or CAS, claims Black feminism as one of many of its influences, but I haven't seen much Black feminism directly engaged with in proper CAS publications. The second part to the second reason is because caste also promotes learning from past social justice movements, especially and as recently promoted with the Radical Animal Studies book from 2022. And it was in early 2022 when Zane and I started working on this chapter together. So I saw this chapter as not only in line with caste principles, but also furthering them and making the Black feminist connection clear. It seemed like so far this has only been done through basically intersectionality within caste, and also using that concept in a way that is not necessarily true to the original usage. Now, I do think that's okay, and this is something that Nash talks about in one of her books on intersectionality, Jennifer Nash. But there was no explanation within these caste writings, though, about why they were using the term intersectionality in the ways they were using it, and no particular acknowledgement of the original context. And so I didn't doubt that the original usage or meaning wasn't known, but I wanted to make it clear that it was, and how Black feminism can be directly applicable within caste. And so it then dawned on me, amidst thinking about this and trying to see how to go about learning some of this history, that somehow, and I don't remember how, I remember hearing that Zane, though, had a previous unpublished writing on Ida Wells. And so I figured this would be a great piece to work on, that Zane would probably be more likely to write something if it was basically already drafted and not have to do something from scratch, as well as Ida Wells being one of those names that I had come across but never seen anyone quote or really go into in any depth. So this was my impetus for the chapter, and this perspective is largely what I tried to bring to the chapter. And in fact, I believe it was Zane's suggestion to connect Wells explicitly to caste through notions of animality. And it was the book's other editor, Sarah Tomasello's suggestion to mention caste at a few points throughout the chapter explicitly as well. I originally didn't or intended not to do either of those things, to highlight Wells on her own and to make that idea, to implicitly show that idea fell within caste's purview. And so the chapter is framed in terms of caste in the chapter's intro, and the point was to say, here are the points at which Black feminism and caste overlap, and what follows is a caste treatment of Black feminism. And so I at first wanted to leave a direct link out with the point that examining Wells herself was an instance of critical animal studies by its own principles. No real explanation needed. In caste, this is because caste is all about it's about all social justice issues, not just non-human animals. And so the plight of Black women is its own cause worthy of caste's attention, regardless of any connections to animal liberation. So nonetheless, Wells was a progenitor to more contemporary authors on Blackness and animality, such as Aff and Sil Coe, Benedicte Boisseron, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Zakiya Jackson, and perhaps most recently Sharon Patricia Holland, who later in 2023 came out with the book And Other. And so the connection between Blackness and animality was prevalent in Wells's activism, especially through her dispelling of the myth, as Zane mentioned, of the bestial race. And Wells's work helped pave the way for these more contemporary authors to interrogate comparisons between human and non-human oppression, how to do this helpfully and respectfully. And so Wells was here first, or at least before some of the other authors that I mentioned and some of the other people that I've read about. So now, this is not the place to get into the idea of comparing oppressions specifically, but what we show in the chapter is how Wells was an early progenitor of these sorts of conversations. And that's important. This is part of a history of a social movement, and one that braids into issues critical animal studies has a prominent voice about, as well as a stake in, and additionally because a lot of these issues are still very prescient. So as Zane mentioned a little bit, but that I want to bring into caste a little bit directly here, Southern whites use the otherization and the animalization of Black men as an excuse to repress and control Black communities violently. And as Claire Jean Kim posits, race has been articulated in part of a metric of animality as a classification system that orders human bodies according to how animal they are and how animal they are not. And so the media's more current portrayals of LeBron James and Barack Obama as monkeys or apes are similar to those of the past. So these issues have very much not gone away, but neither has the resistance to them. And so that's part of what we wanted to show, look at, and learn from in this chapter. So, of course, these issues that Wells has been fighting against are still salient, and Wells helped to lead the way on them. She helped start such a dialogue. And Wells was a primary figure in interrogating the black rapist and the bestial race discourses that dehumanized and animalized black men especially. And in doing this, Wells described an early controlling image for black men. Black people are not any more or any less animal than white people. They were and they are animalized in an attempt to affirm an erroneous and feeble white supremacy. And this is necessarily so. Lies must be constructed to uphold a system that has no evidential or factual basis. Wells's deft deconstruction of the human-animal binary over a century ago helped create a historical lineage of black and ecofeminists from which Cass draws inspiration. And so we outlined some of that in the chapter. And so one last thing I want to mention, again, as Zane did, but with a few different details, is about Wells refusing to give up her seat on a train and being physically forced off. So an additional detail is that in that struggle, Wells bit the conductor's hand as a way of resisting her treatment. And so, in fact, there was also, I just learned, I think I've heard this before, but I just came across this last week as well. There was also Claudette Colvin from the United States who predated Rosa Parks's bus incident as well. And Colvin was a dark-skinned teenager. Also in Montgomery, Alabama, where Parks had her incident as well. And for many years, Montgomery's black leaders did not publicize Colvin's resistance efforts. Her case was actually dropped by civil rights campaigners because she was unmarried and pregnant during the incident. And it is now widely accepted that these reasons are why the mainstream civil rights movement did not want to use Colvin as some sort of face of resistance. Rosa Parks has even said that, quote, if the white press got a hold of that information, they would have had a field day. They'd call her a bad girl, and her case wouldn't have had a chance. And so this message also kind of ties into Wells's deconstruction of proper womanhood, right, and things like that. So Colvin was young, pregnant, unmarried, too dark, right, to be the face that a movement wanted to portray as very civilized. And so Wells's behavior, biting the hand of the conductor, forcing her off the train, wasn't civilized either, right? But it is this radicality and this history that Cass aims to celebrate. And so it's this sort of notion, this history, this radicality, this incisiveness that we aim to bring to this chapter and into Cass and really interject that in an explicit way.
That's great, Nathan and Zane. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate people writing about Ida B. Wells because, like you, when I read her autobiography some years ago, I was like, why don't I know about her? Why is her name not something that I have heard all my life? And everything that she's done has been so incredible and so powerful. And she was incredible. All the things that she did and all the obstacles that she overcame and the physical threats and her burning down her newspaper and all these incredible things that happened to her. An absolute force of nature. And a couple of things that I want to talk about that you touched on, and I think is really interesting. This concept of expediency in choosing the person who's going to be the face of your movement, and the example and so forth. We still see that in whatever movements, whether we see that in the animal justice movement, whether we see that in other movements, and so on. I mean, do you share that view that it's still a current thing?
I'll hop on that one. So this was actually, I did this in my undergrad capstone. And so I was really invested in this idea of looking through white supremacy and its entanglements with gendered and racial politics and this idea of respectability, right? And I think what Ida B. Wells' work shows is this idea that whiteness is always prioritized. Assimilation into white supremacy is the fastest way for a certain kind of person or people to gain access to privilege. And so when I actually did my thesis, I would build that theory up into looking at this group called the Black Pride 4 in 2017. They were a group of Black trans folks, mostly, who stopped a pride parade in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, to have a moment of silence for murdered Black trans women. And the pride parade, which was organized by, ironically, a mostly white-led organization called Stonewall, worked with the police who were trained by the Israeli Defense Forces to arrest them on trumped-up charges. And Stonewall did not support the Black trans folks. They supported the police, and mostly the white parade goers celebrated when they were being arrested. And so a lot of my work on that was looking through not just the discourse and how whiteness and privilege exists in lesbian and gay spaces, and has a lot of these white suffragettes I've been learning were white lesbians, maybe whether or not they identified like that. They had platonic, romantic and sexual relationships with other women. But they saw the best way to have the political rights of white women for them was through working with white supremacy. And that's similarly with a lot of the lesbian gay movements we've seen now. This idea that white lesbians and gays have really thrown under the bus Black trans folks and queer folks. And we're seeing the harm of that very visibly now with these attacks on queer and trans lives. I also just want to mention that even though how difficult and insurmountable these issues seem to be, Wells is very clear that it's a very bad rhetoric. It's a bad discourse. It doesn't make sense, and poking holes in it. I was just actually at this queer poet book author's talk, and they were talking through how white supremacy is basic. You know, what we're seeing now with the same animalization of Palestinians, and specifically queer and trans Palestinians, is basic, right? And so we have to look through it and draw attention to the holes in that logic, like Wells did, in every space we're in, because it's all connected, right? The same assimilationist tactics that cemented, white supremacy and segregation during Wells' time has continued to grow, and who has access to that maybe has changed. But at the same time, if we're not centering the people who are most harmed by that and poking holes in that logic, then we're going to see this harm just ripple effect.
In terms of expediency, that word, it's an interesting word, because it would be inaccurate if anyone really tries to look at how social justice struggles are linked, oppressions are linked. You can't eradicate one without eradicating the others, right? And if you try, then you're really just going nowhere, right? You're kind of running in place. You're doing a lot to do nothing. Some group might be elevated, but it is at the expense of others. And so there has been no real gain. And that is the problem. And in terms of it still being an issue, I mean, Zane gave examples, of course it's still an issue. And that's still a big problem. It was an issue back in the day with Ida Wells. It was an issue during the civil rights movement, as we both kind of talked about a little bit. I found out fairly recently, I think in like 2023 or something, that I believe women actually comprised, I think, over 50%, the majority of Black Panther membership. And this is something that I never knew of. Every incidence of the Black Panthers I've heard of were male names, men, seemingly. And it turns out they might have even been the minority in that organization. So, it was happening then for sure. The 2017 Women's March on Washington, same sort of thing. Whiteness ended up being kind of centered in that. And I know there was some negotiation and a little bit of backpedaling, and they worked to fix that a bit, but it was still kind of the implicit norm. That's what was put forward first. And even with Occupy Wall Street, there's a great book called Are We the 99%? that analyzed that slogan and that sort of identity of who really is the 99%. Does that include all of us, and to the same extent? And it was found again that kind of that whiteness was pushed forward, heterosexuality was pushed forward, as well as being middle class and basically having a home. A lot of homeless people were kind of displaced or disparaged during that occupation, as well as the whole issue of indigenous people, the right to land and such. And so none of that's okay. All of that is expediency, whether it was implicit or explicit, or whether anyone was aware of that or not, it's all trying for that, but it's not going to actually help. It's not going to result in the revolutionary change that we need.
I completely agree. And I see it too, a lot of times, even amongst, there's always well-meaning there that's at a certain level. There's a well-meaning and this idea that the problem will be solved through this expediency, that if we can just get the foot in the door, then we can make it okay for everyone else. But that invariably, you're really you're sacrificing the group or the people, the victim, really, to use the word kind of loosely, but the people and the animals, so human and non-humans who are suffering the injustices. When you're doing that, you're decentering them, you're decentering your ideas and your advocacy and your thinking away from them, and centering it on the people who are actually doing the oppressing. And so when you're making something that is expedient, so that becomes more acceptable to whether it's white supremacist or whether it's to a non-vegan space, you're really sacrificing everyone else just to make the other, who is already in control, comfortable. And I always come up against that, and I find that that's a very common thread throughout any of the spaces that we occupy. And I really liked your essay because it brought that out and shows how that is something that we as people have been dealing with for a very long time. And it doesn't have to be that way, but you have to have the courage to actually address things as they are, and to recenter your own advocacy and your own education and your own thinking. You have to recenter it on who the oppressed are, rather than who you're speaking to. I mean, yes, presentation and all of that, but ultimately you've got to keep that focus, the center in mind. Before we go, where can people follow your work, online or otherwise? And do you have any projects that you'd like to promote?
I'll go first. I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Zane Crit Theory, because I try to do a lot of critical work and finding these intersections of harm. I also have a book coming out soon with Peter Lang. It's called Building Multi-Species Resistance Against Exploitation, Stories from the Front Line of Labor and Animal Rights. It's mostly about this idea of how labor struggles are interconnected, not just in the people who work in slaughterhouses, as well as the harm happens to non-human animals, but also in the nonprofits and the animal advocacy organizations that we work for to combat these issues.
I don't have too much of a public profile. I have rather a hostile relationship to social media, and there is always the conundrum of visibility versus, I suppose, who you're supporting in order to get that visibility. So I only have my own personal Facebook page, so people can search for me, find me that way if they want, but no other sort of public facing site. I am also working on another book, or in the later stages of another book that's set to come out in early 2025. That's called Exploring Topics in Nonhuman Coexistence. And so that is co-edited again, and it's with my fairly long-time collaborator, Sarah Tomasello, as well as Aaron Jones and Mark Suhita, two other people that I've known for a while. So that'll be coming out on Lantern Publishing and Media.
You both have a fascinating and really worthwhile body of work. So I'm looking forward to seeing the new book, and maybe you'll come back on at some point, because that would be really great. Thank you again, and good luck with everything. Thanks again so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having
Thanks,
me.
Emmy.
My first introduction to Ida B. Wells was reading her autobiography entitled Crusade for Justice. What's remarkable about it is Wells doesn't just focus on the grand things she did. Actually, she doesn't focus on those at all. She writes in great detail of everything she did and why. And all the parts are equally important because they're all part of the struggle, not just the big shiny moments. For example, when she writes about the trips she took to England, not only does she tell the reader about what she spoke and wrote about, but also about getting seasick while on the way. Wells writes about her concerns and struggles as a person, the slog of fundraising, the various times she was threatened physically by white supremacists or wronged by those even on her side, including such figures as W.E.B. Du Bois. In other words, she shows readers, no matter what was thrown at her, her activism didn't stop because she knew what she was doing was the right thing and needed to be done. All she wanted was for those whose humanity had been recognized as a right and their status as property been abolished to be able to live their lives like any other person. So she just got up each day and did it. That's it. Despite the injustices being pervasive and relentless. So bringing it back around to veganism, fighting for justice, whether human or non-human, is a slog. There's no denying that. And for most of us, in terms of vegan activism and education, it won't be as fraught or dangerous to our persons as things were for Ida Wells. We'll encounter successes, failures, and strife. And we can look to activists in other spheres from different times, how things were difficult for them too. But they persisted. A friend said to me, he thought Think Like a Vegan was one of the most terrifying books he's ever read. Not because of any graphic content, there isn't, but because the horrors of animal use are pervasive and relentless. How could I go on, he asked. My immediate and instinctual response was because they're pervasive and relentless. I've got to do whatever I can. It's the least I can do.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round and around.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com. You can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
Speed things up when we go round and around and around and around. We speed things up when we go round. Things up, tear things up when we go round. Burn things up when we go round. Things up when we go round and around and around and around. We speed things up when we go round.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.